Hello, everyone. So, welcome to this short lecture on the Euthyphro. So, it's one of my favorite dialogues, as some of you may know, uh, because here we see really Socrates in action, um, like never before. Uh, Even in the Apology, which we are covering right after the Euthyphro, when he's actually in court. Uh, he actually has more of a dialogue here in the Euthyphro than in the Apology, because in the Apology, he's mainly just defending himself, he's making his case, and he doesn't really have a dialogue partner except for a very small section when he's talking to Miletus. So in the Euthyphro, we get a glimpse at the way Socrates philosophized, right? And so we can learn from the very beginning uh, the style of philosophizing that characterizes Socrates and what made him famous, really. And I may have mentioned already in the talk that I had with you guys previously that the beginning of the dialogue says, "This is something new, Socrates." And my first philosophy professor mentioned that oftentimes literary writers, and Plato being a literary figure, tends to write in this way as well, that the first word or line is very significant or symbolic of the whole. Uh, and so he suggested that this fact that the word new is mentioned in that first line in connection with Socrates means that he's introducing something new, or that he himself is something new, or is representing something new. And in fact, it does make sense in the context of the pre-Socratic philosophers that we've covered, the nature philosophers, to see how Socrates is such a new kind of philosopher, right? And in fact, we can say he's different in several layers, but let's just say for now that we see clearly, on the one hand, his style of philosophizing is different. Um, his style of philosophizing is different, as well as the content that which he's interested in, right? And in fact, his style of philosophizing was something quite new at this point. And I forgot to write it on the board, but it's called the Elenchus method. Elenchus method, which is essentially the style of question and answer that we see Socrates taking in the Euthyphro, um, and which is also characterized as cross-examination, which we know lawyers have now made that famous, right? Um, and so let's just go over some of the general details of the dialogue, and then go into the central theme of the dialogue, and explore, right, what we are to learn, right, a bit. And so by and large, just as I said already, what we can learn in general is simply the style of philosophizing that makes Socrates famous, and as well as the spirit of philosophy, specifically how he philosophizes in terms of this this question and answer style, as well as a kind of consistency and reasoning that he's seeking, as well as thirdly, seeking for precise definitions of concepts. Uh, and here, as we'll see, the main theme or concept exploring with Euthyphro is the notion of piety, or as I state here, in several things: righteousness, justice, virtues, moral goodness, right? So he's seeking the precise definition of what this concept entails or means, right? But the general dialogue begins with Socrates in the front of the court before he's going to defend himself in the apology, right? So he's in front of the court and he bumps into Euthyphro by accident, apparently, and they begin to speak, right? And they catch up, and Euthyphro is surprised that Socrates is in court. He thinks he's a good guy, and he's like, "What are you doing in court? This is a strange for you to be in court. I can't imagine you having done anything wrong or being here to prosecute someone else, right?" So Socrates says, "Indeed, I'm not here to prosecute anybody, but actually accusing me." And he states what he's being accused of, corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of Athens in particular, right? Um, and then I didn't write this on the board, but then there's this interesting um, side comment that Socrates makes about Meletus, the guy who's accusing him. And interestingly enough, we begin to see a little bit about Socrates' character, basically, of being a very ironic person, meaning we can't take everything he does or says completely literally, right? He often has hidden meanings or a hidden agenda behind some of his words. So we have to pay attention to what are his intentions, right? And what he says about Meletus is actually that he's beginning in the right way, i.e., looking for who is corrupting the youth and trying to get rid of that person, namely him, which happened to be him, according to Socrates. Um, and that we should be caring for the youth of our country or state, right? Of the city of Athens in particular here, right? He says, he's beginning in a good way, and even compliments him and says, so he's likely to be wise then, because he's starting the right way, caring for the youth and so forth. But we can question whether he really means this, because we see that then in the apology, he actually says the exact opposite, that this man Meletus is not wise and he doesn't care for the youth, right? That he's basically a charlatan. He's pretending, right? And he has ill intent towards Socrates, and that's why he's prosecuting him, right? And that his accusations are not well founded. Anyhow, so we see how Socrates sort of plays certain roles for different reasons, right? And later on, we'll see how Socrates also sort of playfully, I think, says that he wants to be Euthyphro's pupil, right? As we'll see in a minute why, he actually says, "Let me be your student," right? Now, we'll see that again, he has a hidden agenda behind that, and we'll explore in good detail what his agenda is here. But it's quite amusing to see that someone 70 years old, which Socrates was at this time, is asking to be the student of this younger 40-year-old man, right? But as we'll see, Euthyphro is actually, or as you might have noticed in the dialogue, Euthyphro is actually a priest, and considers himself a prophet, right? So he thinks he has a great amount of wisdom, which will play into why Socrates acts the way he acts with Euthyphro. So continuing the story, we see that after Socrates says why he's there and has a little bit of a dialogue about other things, he says, Euthyphro says that he's prosecuting his own father for murder, right? So Socrates first is shocked, right, that he's prosecuting his own father, and then even more shocked that he's prosecuting him for murder, because obviously that can get him killed or executed. So Socrates is really disturbed by this news, and so he asked for more details, and we find out more as to why Euthyphro is prosecuting his father. And some of the details we see is that the father put a servant in a ditch, right, in a hole on the ground, because the man had killed someone else in a drunken anger, right? The man happened to be a servant of theirs, who killed another servant when he was drunk, right? And then as the man was in the ditch, Euthyphro's father sent someone, a messenger, to find out what to do with this man. who was in the ditch, right? So he sent a messenger to a priest in the court to find out what should be done, what the right thing, righteous thing to do was, or the pious thing, right? So he's waiting for the guy to come back, the messenger to come back, but the guy dies, right? The servant dies in the ditch. And so Euthyphro thinks that the father is guilty, right? As I say here, Euthyphro thinks the father is guilty of murder because he did not feed the man or give him water this time that he was waiting. And so the man died because the father did not provide the needs that the servant needed, right, while he was in the ditch. Now, the family, as I state here, remained angry with Euthyphro because they believed he was wrong on three counts, that he was acting wrongly or impiously, unrighteously on three counts. So his family believed he was wrong because he didn't kill the servant, according to them. He didn't mean to kill them. Perhaps an argument for why the father didn't mean to kill the servant is that he actually sent for a servant to find out what to do. If he wanted to kill the guy, he would have just left him in the ditch. That's it. Or killed him some other way. Um, and so there's reason to believe that perhaps he didn't mean to kill him, right? And it was accidental. He didn't know he would die so quickly, or that the servant would take that long coming back, right? The second reason might be, or not might be, the second reason the family has for being upset with Euthyphro is that the man was a murderer anyway, so he deserved to die, right? Eye for an eye, or capital punishment, right? If someone kills someone, many people think that's justification for having them punished with death as well. Thirdly, they say he's wrong because his son should not prosecute their father, right? There's family loyalty as a kind of ethical principle that one should take care of one's family and so forth, right? So that's the general context of the dialogue that is going on here in the Euthyphro, right, between Socrates and Euthyphro. And so that's the context. And then after Socrates finishes, after Euthyphro finishes explaining why he's prosecuting his father, Socrates is shocked and says, "Wow, you're amazing." Or I'm totally surprised, says Socrates, that you are not afraid of being wrong in the situation if things happen the way you described them, right? In other words, Socrates suggests, I think rightly so, that the details of the situation are not so clear cut. And so that anyone in his position would reasonably doubt whether it would be the right thing to prosecute the father, right? Perhaps he did something wrong, but it's not clear whether he's actually a murderer, right? Whether he really intended it. But we see that Euthyphro has no doubt at all that he's doing the right thing. In fact, he says that his family's wrong because they know nothing of piety, they know nothing of righteousness. And he says, I'm a priest who has knowledge of what is pious, what is righteous and unrighteous, good and the bad. I have this divine knowledge, and I wouldn't be better than most men if I didn't have this knowledge. He literally says he is better than most men, right? Because he has this knowledge. So Socrates says, "Oh, really? If you have this knowledge, then let me be your pupil, because I've been wanting to know the answer to this question my whole life, right? I've been pondering this for many years, almost a lifetime. What is righteousness? What is justice for the pious? Right? What is piety?" So this is something that Socrates has been concerned with already. And so Euthyphro claiming this kind of knowledge motivates him to say, oh, okay, well, let's see if it's true that you truly know this. And so that was his hidden motive, as I mentioned before, for what I think is somewhat playful, saying, let me be your pupil, let me be your student, right? I mean, I think he's genuine in that he wants to see clarity about what piety is, along with Euthyphro, perhaps. Mm, but I think he's somewhat playful in saying, let me be your student, right? Let me be your pupil. So then this is the central theme that begins to unfold in the dialogue, where Socrates is challenging Euthyphro to clarify what is exactly piety, what is righteousness or the pious. And so this is the central theme of the dialogue and where the sort of the fun stuff happens, right? So there are several attempts that come out in the dialogue from Euthyphro with respect to what piety is, right? In other words, he attempts to define it many times. And interestingly enough, Socrates finds flaws with everything that Euthyphro proposes. Here, I'm just going to talk about three main ones that are most popular or interesting philosophically. And so we're going to cover them here. The three attempts are the following. So the first one goes like this. He says, Euthyphro says to Socrates, what I am doing right now is the pious. What I am doing right now is the pious, prosecuting the wrongdoer. Prosecuting the wrongdoer. Now, you could even put this as a, a logical format um, where it might clarify things, where Euthyphro could have said or stated his argument as if someone commits a wrong, they should be prosecuted. My father committed a wrong, therefore my father should be prosecuted. That was a modus ponens for you guys who were paying attention and know modus ponens well. So that was a modus ponens. Now that sounds a bit better than just saying what I am doing right now is the pious, right? So if I were to put it in that structure, it sounds a little better, but notice that it doesn't really answer the question because it begs a question. In other words, the concept of wrongness or impiety is still within the statement, within the assumption. In other words, if I say, if someone commits wrong, i.e., an impiety, then they should be punished. But we still don't know what the impious is. So he can't just say what I am doing right now, prosecuting a wrongdoer, an impious person. That's what's pious because you still haven't defined the impious or the pious, right? But the way that Socrates responds is the following. The problem is that this is just an example. So Euthyphro is saying, look, I'm prosecuting my father, and that is the pious. Socrates says, okay, great. Perhaps that's true, but that is an example, one instance of something that's pious. So even if I grant you that that's pious, you haven't shown me what the pious in general is, right? And what the pious in general is would be its definition or the general form or structure, nature of that which is pious. And so Socrates is saying, you still haven't answered my question, right? In other words, my goal is to have the concept of piety, the general notion of piety, or what he sometimes calls the forms, what Plato calls the form of piety, or the form of something. It's its general essence, right? So what is the essence of piety? And Socrates is saying, you still haven't told me. You just gave me an example. It's kind of like saying, what is a building? If I ask that question and someone just pointed, oh, that's a building. Okay, I could look at it and kind of think, okay, that's a building, but could I would I be able to point out another building by myself if I didn't have anything further beyond that example, right? In other words, I would need to be told something more specific about the general nature of what entails a building, right? So likewise, he's saying, look, you just gave me one example, and therefore I cannot know what piety is. In other words, Socrates suggests to Euthyphro that what he's looking for is the general essence of what the pious is. And the importance of that is so that he can see for himself what is pious and what is not, right? In other words, knowing one instance or several instances of what is pious does not allow him to know what the pious is in such a way that he can discern it for himself, right? And that's the goal. So he continues and says, so try again, Euthyphro, and he does try again. In fact, he tries many times, and we're going to cover another one that's interesting. Here, number 2 says, what the gods love, says Euthyphro. What the gods love, or in the text it says what is dear to the gods, but I'm using love just to be more consistent with the next definition. But he says what the gods love is pious, and what the gods hate is impious. And Socrates says, great, this is a bit better, closer to the kind of answer I was looking for, right? This sounds a bit more like a definition, a bit more like a general statement that can help me discern what the pious is in different situations, right? So it's more broad than the previous answer. So great, he says, yes, so what the gods love is pious, and what they hate is impious. Now, Socrates begins to question Euthyphro, and the problem that he leads Euthyphro into is a blatant contradiction in this definition. And I encourage you to reread this if you haven't already. Because it's quite revealing as to Socrates' approach and how interesting it is, and it's an enjoyable dialogue because we see how Euthyphro seems quite confident in his answer, and then when Socrates questions him in several ways, Euthyphro is not aware that Socrates is leading him to a blatant contradiction with the very first thing that he agrees with, right? For example, I'll just do it quickly. He says, Socrates asks him, okay, I like your answer. Now answer me this. Do you believe in the stories of the gods? Euthyphro says, yes. Okay. Now, in the story of the gods, from Homer and Hesiod, we know that it seems like the gods fight amongst each other and argue, just like humans. And he says, what do they? Well, first of all, Euthyphro answers again, yes, that is true, that the gods fight each other. And Socrates says, oh, well, that's interesting. Okay. And then he asks more questions and he says, and what do you think they argue about? And Euthyphro and Socrates gives them a few answers like mathematics or geometry, or rather things like justice, right and wrong. And Euthyphro, and he gets Euthyphro to say they argue about actually right and wrong, right? So this is interesting because then he's saying, if that's the case, Euthyphro, are you not saying that something can be both righteous and not righteous, pious and impious, according to your definition, right? And why is that? Because he says, well, look, if the gods end up disagreeing about the right or the wrong, or the pious and the impious, or what they love and do not love, he says, well, look, if that's the case, that means that if the gods love something or someone, as we say here, if the gods love something or someone, that makes it pious. But if they disagree about what they love, or what they find pious or not, and one of them hates that same thing, it would make it impious, right? So let me state that again, because I think I didn't state it quite clearly. Essentially, he's saying, look, according to your definition, Euthyphro, if your definition says that what the gods love makes something pious, then one God could love something and another God can hate that same thing. And therefore it would make it both pious and impious. So if I take your definition, Euthyphro, I could not use it to discern whether something is pious or not. Pious because according to your definition, it could be both. And so we are stuck again, not knowing what the pious is, right? So Socrates. So at this point in the dialogue, very interestingly, when Socrates points out this blatant contradiction, I think Euthyphro's a bit embarrassed, perhaps shocked, and he didn't know what to say next. And Socrates actually helps him and says, all right, well, perhaps we can work with this definition and tweak it a little bit, right? Fix it. And Euthyphro says, okay. And here's my suggestion. What if perhaps he gives him the benefit of the doubt? He says, perhaps Euthyphro, you meant that what all the gods love is the pious, right? When they're all in agreement. And so this is the reworking of the definition. And he says, okay, well, what all the gods love is the pious, and then the impious is the opposite. What all the gods hate is the impious. And Socrates says, okay, that's a better definition. I like it. It's an improvement, apparently, upon this other definition, the previous one, right? So far, so good. Okay, so if all the gods love something, it makes it pious. And what all the gods hate makes it impious. Well, now Socrates makes another interesting move. And right after this is what the dialogue ends. And the move is he asks Euthyphro, well, is it the case that the gods' love of something makes it pious, or is it pious because they love it? In other words, let me rewrite this here. So in other words, he's asking the question, a kind of cause and effect question, or maybe a chicken and an egg, you might ask. But it makes more sense with the question and effect notion. So we could say, so you have the love of God, and he's saying it makes it pious. But could it be that the pious is love because it is pious, right? In which direction does it go? So does the God's love cause the pious? Or do the gods love it because it is pious? And Socrates suggests that it's actually the former that makes more sense. That the gods, sorry, the latter, the bottom one is the one that would make more sense, right? That the gods would love that which is pious, right? If the gods love something or someone, it's because they are pious, right? Because something is pious, is that they would love it, right? So this answer makes more sense, right? And so to continue in the dialogue, Socrates gives some examples to try to make this clear what his challenge to Euthyphro is, because he's confused, probably as you are right now. in hearing this kind of answer, right? And his examples are not that helpful, but I'll give one example that may help you understand his question here. And the example is, if you imagine the phenomenon of seeing something, right? And so when we see something with a certain color, let's say green, like let's imagine I'm looking at a tree. Now, what explains my seeing of this color of the leaves of the tree, right? So does my seeing something as green, so if I see the leaves as green, are the leaves green because I'm seeing them as green? Or are they green and therefore I can see the greenness, right? Which one is it, right? Do I, in other words, make the leaves green by seeing them as green and therefore I create the greenness? Or does the tree have green leaves and therefore I perceive them as green? In other words, what is the cause of it? Is the greenness caused by my eyes? Or does the greenness of the thing cause me to see it as green? The second one is the one that makes sense, right? There's an inherent quality of greenness in the tree leaves, and therefore I perceive it as green. And that's what Socrates is saying here. He's saying, well, look, if the gods love the pious, it must be because there's something inherently pious about the thing, and that's what makes them love it, right? Just like the greenness of the tree would make us see it as green. The other way around doesn't make sense, right? My seeing the tree as green doesn't make it green, right? But that's what this implies according to Socrates, that if the gods' love makes something pious, then that doesn't seem to make sense, right? Because it seems that perhaps the pious is loved because it is pious, right? That explains the notion of piety more clearly according to Socrates, right? And then this, of course, this notion some people have called the kind of divine command theory. We can translate this into a more modern context, right? A more contemporary context or language by saying it's kind of like, well, first, if Euthyphro holds this view, which he seemed to want to hold at first, it's kind of like, well, God can choose what is righteous, right? In other words, God commands what is right and wrong. He says something is wrong, then it's wrong. If God says murder is wrong, then it's wrong. God says lying is wrong. Him saying it makes it wrong. So that's kind of what this says here, right? And Socrates is challenging that and saying, no, God would say something is wrong because it is wrong. Or if he says something is righteous and good, it's because it is inherently good and righteous. But what's the problem with this? If this is the answer, which Socrates thinks is the answer, what's the problem? The problem is there is still no definition of piety. In other words, he says to Euthyphro, you strange fella, you still have not answered my question of what the pious is, right? Because it seems like this is the case, that the pious must be loved by the gods because it is inherently pious. That's why they love it, right? But if that's the case, then we still don't know what the pious is. And Euthyphro basically says, you know what, Socrates, it's getting late. I have an appointment, time to go. Bye. And he actually leaves without any further discussion, right? Perhaps he came to an understanding that he could not answer Socrates satisfactorily. He gave up and left. Now, what we could learn is that perhaps he didn't actually know what the pious is, right? Maybe he didn't really give it much thought up to that point, right? And that's what Socrates wanted to really show, right? That's what we learn here, that Socrates um, really saw it as his mission, as we'll see later in the Apology, to show people who thought they had certain kind of knowledge or wisdom that they didn't actually have the kind of knowledge they assumed they had, right? And unfortunately, we never know, we never found out if Euthyphro actually came to realize his lack of knowledge, right? But it's likely from what we see in the dialogue that he didn't quite realize it, at least in that moment, right? He sort of ran away from Socrates without answering, right? Now, one last thing I want to mention is that while this is the ending of the dialogue where he says, Socrates ends by saying, well, look, this is the answer that makes the most sense, where the pious is loved by the gods because it is inherently good, right? Pious. And so it seems like he dismisses the divine command theory, right? That the gods could make something pious. But in some modern theories or in the philosophies of some thinkers in modern times that use a more theistic notion, they've said that this dilemma could be solved by saying that that God could make something pious or good, or cause something that is pious and good, because God himself is goodness or is good and righteous, and therefore what he would command would be good or righteous, right? And so that there's no conflict, right? Um, and some of the objections that have been said about the divine command theory is precisely that it seems like if this is the case, then God could kind of randomly choose what's good and bad, and sort of make, let's say, murder good, murder uh, uh, be a good thing. If God says murder is good, then it's good under the divine command theory, it seems, right? Or if God says, it's okay to lie, then it makes lying good. And that seems strange to us, right? Well, the answer is what I said. Some people say, well, no, God would never make such a command because God himself is good, right? So that's one modern dialogue around that notion of divine command theory that comes up in the Euthyphro in this context, right? But anyhow, that's it for the Euthyphro. I hope you enjoyed it. Continue to contemplate some of these philosophical questions. And as usual, I like to sort of bring things down to our everyday existence, and so making things practical for us. And so one of the things I like to take away from this dialogue is the idea of how confident we are about the things that we know, right? And so perhaps we should be more cautious about the assumptions we make about our knowledge, right? And like Euthyphro, uh, we need to be careful to not be too arrogant in our assumptions about what we know, right? And so Socrates sort of pushes us to really think and reflect on what we actually know. And so I think this is a warning for us to be careful with that. And so with that, I'll let you guys go. Good luck and be well.